Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, friends of FIA, good afternoon and welcome to the second iteration of FIA's NATO in Focus seminar series. I'm really happy to see a full house today. My name is Matti Pesu. I'm a leading researcher here at the Institute. I'm currently in charge of a few research projects, including one studying Finland's evolving role in Euro-Atlantic security. And today, our event reflects FIA's and I hope the broader Finnish ambition to understand the nature and the trajectory of the alliance Finland is joining very soon. Our theme today will be NATO's diversity and cohesion. Originally, NATO was established by 12 allies. After Finland's and Sweden's accession, NATO will have 32 members. Really a diverse bunch of nations with varying strategic cultures and threat perceptions stemming from different geography and history. Allies in the East tend to perceive security concerns differently than allies in the Mediterranean. Finland, as a newcomer, must learn to navigate in this environment, and the diversity of the alliance is one factor setting the realities within which allies are pursuing their interests and objectives. This afternoon, we will not only touch on the question of alliance cohesion, but also delve into NATO outlooks of specific allies, namely the United Kingdom, Poland, and Norway. I will now have the pleasure to introduce today's four speakers who have also participated in a two-day workshop here in Helsinki, organized by NATO Defence College, Stockholm Peace Research Institute, and FIA. The event dealt with the implications of Finland's and Sweden's NATO accession for the alliance. So our first speaker today will be Thierry Tardy. He's the director of the research division at NATO Defence College in Rome. He has held senior research and management positions at the Institute for Security Studies in Paris and also the Geneva Center for Security Policy and the Foundation for Strategic Research in Paris. And his fields of expertise include NATO, policy and adaptation, the European Union, common security and defence policy, NATO, EU relations, the politics of crisis management, UN peace operations, and French security and defence policy. And he is also the editor of a recent book, an excellent overview of different profiles in NATO, the different approaches of allies to the alliance, a really good and solid volume. I highly recommend you to read it. Our second speaker today is Carsten Friis. He's a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs and New Peace Research Group on Security and Defence. He has significant expertise in the Western Balkans. He was a part of EU Special Envoy Miroslav Lajcak's team for referendum on independence in Montenegro in 2006, and he has also worked in Norwegian Armed Forces and served at KFOR operation in Kosovo. His main area of expertise is security and defense policy, international military operations, civilian military relations, Nordic security, cybersecurity, as well as as I said, the Western Balkans. Our third speaker, Ed Arnold, he's a research fellow for European security within the International Security Studies Department at RUSI in London. His experience covers defense, intelligence, counterterrorism, and counterinsurgency. And his primary research focus currently is on British defense, security, and foreign policy, specifically relating to transatlantic cooperation. And he has also a particular interest in UK national security strategy and strategic defense and security reviews. And for our fourth speaker this afternoon is Justyna Gotkowska. She's a deputy director at the Center for Eastern European Studies in Warsaw, Poland. Formerly, she was a coordinator of the regional security program at the Institute and an analyst in the Department for Germany and Northern Europe at the MFA or at the Institute. Yeah, at the Institute. Yes. She is a visiting scholar at the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies and at the University of Bundeswehr in Munich. And her fields of expertise include security and defense policy of Germany, Nordic Baltic states, NATO, and the EU's common security and defense policy from a regional perspective, and military cooperation in Central and Northern Europe. I've asked the panelists to deliver brief opening remarks, roughly 10 minutes. And after these interventions, I will open the floor for questions. But at this point, Terry, take it away.
Thanks a lot, Matti, and thanks to FIA for the invitation. What I'm going to say now is a few words about the concept of cohesion, and I will draw heavily on that volume that we did last year, looking at the national policies of 16 allies towards NATO. And part of what we have done in this book is to look at how those states build cohesion and build the relevance of the Atlantic Alliance. So I will say some words about the concept of cohesion. Then I will offer a typology of states, at least the 16 that we have covered. And relate that typology to the notion of cohesion, how different groups bring or build different types of cohesion. And then I will end with maybe a few words about Sweden and Finland and how they will possibly fit in that typology. So first, on the concept of cohesion, I'd like to start with Glenn Snyder in Alliance Politics, saying that cohesion pertains to how much the members of an alliance are able to, I quote, hold it together. Cohesion is about, NATO cohesion is about the extent to which NATO allies are able to hold it together. It is defined like this, but more precisely, cohesion is about allies' shared interests and values, and how these interests and values are articulated through NATO. So you have these dual components of interests and values that are built through an institution that happens to be NATO. And cohesion is a function of a distance. It's a distance between individual member states and the collective alliance interest, if we accept that there is one thing called a collective alliance interest, the one that is defined by the treaties, by the final declarations of summit, or the one that is defined by consensus within the alliance. So it's important to think about cohesion in terms of a distance between a core, which is the alliance, and member states. And the narrower that distance, the greater the cohesion. The longer that distance between states and the core, the weaker the cohesion. That's an important element of the definition of cohesion. Then there is a debate about whether cohesion is only about interests and how they are articulated, or whether we should factor in values. I'm not going to deal with this, but that's something that we could look at when thinking about cohesion. And the notion of security community applied to NATO suggests that the alliance is more than just about interest. It's also about values, so that needs to be factored in. And the distance I'm talking about is dependent on a number of variables. Those variables are strategic cultures of member states, their foreign and defense policies, threat perceptions, extremely important, the relationship with the US, bilateral relationship with the US, defense spending, contribution to NATO operations, domestic politics. Those different variables, they define the distance between where a state lies and where the medium NATO policy is. So some states have a strategic culture, a foreign policy, a defense policy, domestic politics that make them inherently aligned on the NATO consensus, so the distance is short, right? And for others, these variables tend to create tensions with the rest of the group because the distance is longer, if you follow me. So while the former tend to reinforce cohesion, because they tend to align like spontaneously on what NATO is and does, the latter category can undermine cohesion. So in the book, we've asked authors to look at those different variables, and Justyna is one author of in the book looking at Poland. And then in a separate chapter, we've consolidated those data brought in the 12 chapters looking at 16 countries to create a typology of states based then on 3 sets of variables. One is threat perceptions that we saw as key to determine a state's behavior within the alliance, threat perceptions. Second, relationship to the US, how one state would relate to the US and how that impacts that state's policy vis-à-vis the alliance, and therefore how that impacts cohesion. And third, alternatives to NATO, the extent to which some states have other options than NATO to do security governance activities. So 3 variables: threat perceptions, relationship to the US, and alternatives to NATO. So the typology is the following. And if I could have, great. So I hope that you can see it, but if you don't see it, what I suggest is that you buy the book and the typology is in the book. So I want to say a few words about those 3 categories of states, and I'm confident that would trigger some questions. So in the first category, we have states that A, have a defense policy that is not directly correlated with the NATO policy and that are not systematically aligned on the US policy. B, those states have a security agenda, that's threat perceptions, that goes well beyond NATO's agenda. And C, that's the alternative variable, those states do not necessarily see NATO as an exclusive forum for their own defense policy. They have alternative options. In that first category, we see that there are only 3 states, and this is where a bit the controversy is. It's the US, Turkey, and France. So the US, Turkey, and France are the only 3 countries in the alliance for which the alignment on the US for Turkey and France, not for the US. The alignment on the US is not automatic. It's case by case. It's dependent on a number of issues. Those are the only 3 countries for which, and here I will make a kind of strong argument, for which NATO is dispensable. It is not indispensable, it is dispensable. There are other issues. And there are also the 3 countries that are the least, or the defense policies of which is the least shaped by what NATO is and does. So there is a lot that what they do which is not linked with NATO in defense policy terms. For example, they are the only 3 countries in terms of alternative options that would do national operations. None of the other 27 countries would do national operations. And even the UK, the last or the latest national operation of the UK is Palliser in Sierra Leone in 2000, unless you say otherwise, Ed. But so you have those 3 countries for which, in the strategic culture of which national operations are a possibility, and there are many examples of this. I'm not going to give examples at this stage. In the second category, and I will come back to that in a minute on the first category. In the second category, we have states that are NATO aligned with a Russia-centric agenda. So for those states, once again, I would need to go back to the 3 variables in terms of relationship to the US, threat perceptions, and the existence of alternatives. For those countries that are Russia-centric and NATO aligned, The US, the relationship with the US is instrumental. It is obvious. There is no alternative to NATO, and the threat perception is like single-oriented. It's about Russia, and their defense policy is heavily shaped by what NATO is and does. Of course, I don't lose sight of the fact that NATO is intergovernmental and states shape what. I get that, but those defense policies are heavily shaped by NATO's agenda. And there is no alternative. The EU, for example, is not an alternative. And then there is a third category of states, the NATO aligned, but with a non-Russia-centric agenda. For those states, the relationship with the US is extremely important, but their threat perception is such that Russia is not the only issue. They have a broader agenda, so the UK, Germany, Italy, Spain, those countries, they have a broader agenda than just Russia. And furthermore, for some of them, there are alternative options. And the EU can come as an alternative option for countries like Italy or Germany, not necessarily in the hardcore defense domain, but for security-related, crisis management-related issues. The EU can be an option, which is again not the case for the second category. So that's for the typology, and of course it would require more time to go a bit in detail. But I'd like now to look at how that impacts cohesion. So in terms of the first category, it impacts, those member states are the ones that are the most likely to impact, meaning undermine, cohesion of the alliance. Again, because of the likelihood of that long distance between where they are and what NATO is. So I could multiply examples, but if I just give three names, Trump, Erdogan, Macron, maybe that suffices to illustrate how leaders of those countries and what they said or what they did or what they thought about NATO can have an impact on the cohesion of the alliance. And I developed that, of course, in the chapter, but it is also the only three countries, but maybe you will correct me, and then I will need to do another book. The only three countries where, for example, a debate on pulling out from NATO is possible, has happened in ways that are not really conceivable in other countries. I'm not saying that it was never mentioned in the other countries, but clearly, and one of the three, France, pulled out from the integrated military structure, and that debate has happened in Turkey, and we know that under Trump, that was a debate that was possible. And to push the argument, it is also possible to characterize those three countries are possible disruptors within the alliance. I don't use that term in the book, but this is implied by the characterization of the defense security policies of those three countries vis-à-vis the alliance. If I look at the other two categories are less likely to undermine the cohesion of the alliance because the distance is shorter between what they do or think about NATO and what like the collective NATO policy is. But if I look at, so the NATO aligned with a Russia-centric agenda, I did not mention the countries, but they are. I mean, the Russia-centric NATO aligned are basically Poland, the Baltic states, and Norway, I think, in that typology. So they are less likely to undermine NATO because they are very much aligned on NATO and pushing for an agenda, which is the collective defense agenda that, you know, NATO is like happy to embody and implement, and because of 24th of February, they are heavily dependent on the US, as I said, and there is no alternative to NATO, and therefore, for example, they would not participate in the strategic autonomy debate that, among other effects, had an impact on the cohesion within not only NATO but also the European Union. And this argument will also apply to the third category of allies that are NATO aligned with a non-Russia centric security agenda. Yeah, here I am. But let me now move to the areas where those two categories could lead to undermining the cohesion. One is the threat perceptions. The threat perceptions matter to the typology, and they may lead in the three categories, so including the ones that I said are less likely to undermine the cohesion, they could lead to, for example, the East-South divide in terms of where the priorities of NATO should go, or whether NATO should concentrate on collective defense versus crisis management. So that's a possibility that exists in the three categories. Another example is the defense investment pledge. So in the category of the countries that are Russia-centric, those countries meet the 2% by and large. But in the category of the NATO-aligned, non-Russia-centric, so UK, Germany, Italy, Spain, those countries, with the exception of the UK, the others, they don't meet the defense investment pledge, the 2%. So that's the burden-sharing debate that may undermine cohesion. And also on the role of the EU, they would not only agree on how central the EU should be in terms of NATO-EU relations, defense activities, and that can also undermine the cohesion of the alliance. And you could apply those different sources of undermining the cohesion to the current Ukraine debate on how much we should talk to Russia, how much we should negotiate, the centrality of collective defense, Eastern flank versus other priorities, and again, the role of the European Union. Let me end with maybe a few words on how I see Sweden and Finland as future NATO allies, hopefully. Just a few words to link what I've just said about cohesion and where those countries would most likely be. The first point is probably those two countries, looking at the different variables from strategic culture, defense policy, threat perception, defense spending, most likely those two countries would be in the category of countries building the cohesion more than undermining it. We had an event yesterday and this morning, and one speaker said that Sweden and Finland would be bridge builders. And that is probably a good way to characterize the two countries. They would probably be in the category of the NATO-aligned, Russia-centric kind of countries. That's the reason why they want to join the alliance, right? Because they have this problem with Russia, and NATO is the solution to their problem. So it defines where I think they would be in the three categories. Having said that, there might be two issues where those countries could be at a distance from the core. So going back to the issue of the distance, therefore possibly undermining the cohesion or maybe raising some questions. One is, what if tomorrow NATO needs to do some crisis management activities at the southern periphery of the alliance? How would those two countries, if they are NATO, when they are NATO members, react to that kind of different agenda than the collective defense agenda for which they've joined the alliance? That could increase that distance and therefore be a question for the overall cohesion of the alliance. And maybe the second area is in the relationship between NATO and the European Union. So going back to my issue of alternative options, we know, and you know better than myself, that Finland is a country that has pushed for Article 42.7, which is the kind of the equivalent of Article 5 in an EU setting. But Sweden and Finland, are important EU actors, and depending on how they will think about the EU's role in security and defense, that could also impact the relationship with NATO and also, therefore, the cohesion. So here I don't have it's more a question that I pose than an answer that I have, but that's an area where potentially the distance will grow and therefore the cohesion could be undermined. Thank you.
Thank you, Thierry, for an excellent overview. And I personally find the typology and the three groups as an analyst extremely useful. And I think it's very useful also for the broader audience in grasping NATO's dynamics. But I'll now yield the floor to Karsten.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. Great being here. Let me say first, as a Norwegian, I mean, we're really, really pleased with Finland and Sweden joining NATO. It's probably not necessary to say it, but I still would like to use the opportunity to do so. It does make our defense planning and cooperation much, much easier. We had NORDEFCO, but, you know, armed forces are made to be used in war, and if you couldn't plan for using them in war, they had some shortcomings. So now we can actually plan with using each other's weapons and defense. I'm not part of Thierry's book, so I will be inspired from it, but I will not follow the logic completely. So I'll try to make some brief comments. And maybe I should just take a step back and first say, why do we talk about cohesion? Why is that? Well, it's the very simple point that it's solidarity is the glue that keeps the alliance together. If you don't have a solidarity, if you don't stick together, there's no alliance. Article 5 sounds like a legal article, but actually it's a political commitment. And if you don't have political commitment to support each other, well, there's no alliance. And that does require a shared situational awareness, a shared threat picture to some extent. If not, that solidarity will disappear. We had that in the Soviet Union. That was easy, so to speak, in the old days. It was a kind of easy defined threat. It was more difficult in the years afterwards. It is like easier again now when you had the new Russia, as it were. But it was difficult in the post-Cold War, and many people predicted that the NATO would disappear and dissolve because there was no common threat anymore. That didn't happen for various reasons I will not go into now. But then you had this moment again, like 9/11, which again brought the alliance together, and we had a kind of a purpose, a war on terror. The way we did it didn't go very well, and it tested our cohesion quite a lot during the years, especially the Iraq War, of course, but also what we did in Afghanistan. Let's admit, all of us, we were there, but we didn't really care so much. We were there because of the United States, not so much because of Afghanistan, to be a bit blunt. So I mean, there's been ups and downs in this relationship. Now, if I follow the way you put it, that cohesion is this distance between national interests and the allied interests. You could then think that as a small country in NATO will have to surrender a lot of their interests and values to be part of the coalition, because we cannot expect to get so much of our own interests accepted in the broader community. So, that kind of, from a theoretical point of view, it kind of makes sense. Sorry, I'm just gonna. But if you look at Norway, and that's what I'm supposed to do here, talk a little bit about Norway. Hasn't really been the case. We have had quite a lot of space to define our own, let's say, national interest within the alliance over the years, and I will spend a few minutes on that because. We have had this kind of unique idea about combining deterrence with reassurance, and I'm sure you're all familiar with that, but still I will spend a few minutes on it. So, okay, deterrence is fine. We have the alliance, we have NATO, we have the United States to deter a Russian attack. But this reassurance thing is rather unique, and what's the point of that? And it emerged from the very beginning as an idea to tell Moscow that we wouldn't use our NATO membership as a way to allow United States to attack Russia. So in other words, Norwegian territory should not be a launching pad for an offensive operation. As a result of that, we introduced the basing policy, so we don't have permanent bases until today. You know, we are the only country with a border with Russia that doesn't have enhanced forward presence NATO base. We don't have nuclear weapons either. And also we introduced all these self-imposed restrictions. So the restrictions on what Allied could do and what we did in our own territory. I mean, and Russia haven't done anything similar on their side of the border, but we did. So, you know, Finnmark County, which is bigger than Denmark, has been not demilitarized, but with been very light military presence there. We had restrictions on Allied training and exercises there. Hardly have anything at all. Restrictions on Allied sailings and flights coming from Norway and how far east they should go. Again, for the whole purpose is to not provoke or create impression that we are going to do something aggressively. And all that was accepted because we wanted it. There was never any, you know, there has been probably behind closed doors some challenges on it, but in general we had its policy throughout the period, throughout all the years. We also had lots of pre-positioning of United States equipment. So that's also a way of getting around this thing. We don't have bases, but we have always had lots of airfields, ports, and also army material, US Marine Corps equipment stored in Norway since the 60s, 70s. Nothing new with that. So that's a way of kind of compensating and keeping the deterrence part alive without having bases. So that brings me to, well, actually, sorry. In more recent years, we have also had a new challenge, as that we had increased Allied activity in the High North, which we kind of welcomed because we kind of don't want it to be the forgotten flank. But at the same time, when the British and American ships and planes start operating in our neighborhood, it creates a dilemma. Should we be part of that? If we find it a bit too pushy or too much deterrence to our liking, should we be participate or should we stay away from it? And the decision has been, no, we should engage. They use the term advisory participant. So we participate in these operations, but we don't, you know, and we try to influence how they do it instead of not be part of it. But again, so we have influence, we have a room of maneuver, even within the alliance, and when the big powers want to do to test the Russians. Now, this brings me to another kind of challenge we can have in NATO, is that we have internal cohesion within NATO, but it's also a relationship between us and United States. And that latter part is maybe as important as NATO itself. And there's always a risk that one undermines the other one, that they don't go hand in hand. And there is a risk also that there's a kind of a beauty contest between smaller allies, that we all want to be friends with the United States and get a base Trump or something like that in our territories. And that goes at the expense of NATO cohesion. It's something because, let's be honest, it is only United States that can reinforce us all. It has worked well so far. It's doable, but I think we should be aware of that, and that this doesn't come automatically. That these things do not undermine each other. Lastly, now, and relate to that. So how the way we stay relevant as small states, I guess it goes for all states in NATO. One is location. Norway is in kind of a good place because of the strategic submarines. United States will always be interested in the Arctic because they can strike American homeland. So no matter what happens in NATO, we will always have American interest in the High North, which is could be good news for us or not. But for others, it's the famous 3 C's that we talked about the last few years. It's about capabilities, commitments, and cash, right? And a country like Denmark have kind of compensated with low delivery on some of them by being extremely active in international operations. So you can have a small defense budget, but being extremely active in what you do. So you can balance these things, the 3 C's, with each other, and get away with it. I guess it's getting increasingly difficult to get away on the C, the last C, the cash. as you mentioned, the 2% demand is getting clearer and clearer, and it's difficult to get away with it. So that's a requirement. Now, I think the last, and that's the question for us in Europe, how to keep the Americans in, to stay relevant and therefore contribute to cohesion and alliance survival, is how we can get our act together and actually get more bang for the bucks, or more bang for the euros. In other words, get not only us to be aligned and interoperable, but actually get European capacity to actually operate alone without United States. Not because we plan to do so, but we need to be able to do so in case there are things we must handle that we always have to look to the United States to help us. We are a long way from that, and I think that's going to be an extremely important challenge in the years to come. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Karsten. I think Norway has attracted quite a bit attention here in Finland in terms of its NATO policy, and I think there's rich strategic culture and rich tradition of thinking Finland can tap into as a NATO ally. But next to the UK, Ed.
Thank you very much. I'll make 3 points. First, one on NATO unity and cohesion. The second on the UK's perception of NATO within the Euro-Atlantic. The third on the contribution that the UK makes to the security of the Euro-Atlantic and NATO framework. And then I'll end it up with an overall risk from the UK position. So first thing that I'll say on cohesion and unity is that I thought that cohesion and unity in 2022 was always going to be high for the alliance, regardless of the war in Ukraine. And that was due to some external and internal factors. The external factors, which I think I'll back Karsten up on some of his comments, is that NATO out of area operations, not just in Afghanistan, but also in Libya and also the training mission in Iraq, had not gone well from an operational perspective. And then internal issues that we had that I think you described very well as Trump, Macron and Erdogan, which I don't need to say any more about in terms of comments on NATO, that NATO was really in a difficult position at the start of last year. And what actually happened in terms of the war in Ukraine is that NATO's purpose is back. In times of war, defence policy, there is an element of comfort and reassurance. And certainly while the stakes are higher in the strategic environment that we face this year, for militaries and especially for NATO, defence, deterrence, escalation management, it's what NATO has always done since the signing of the Washington Treaty. And speaking from a UK position and also speaking as an ex-British Army infantry officer from the military domain, that simplicity is where you want it to be as a soldier. You don't want to be fighting the types of expeditionary operations that the UK has fought over the last 20 years, because they are actually very, very difficult and complex. And while the current potential wars that we might have to fight are certainly more brutal, there is an element of that simplicity is exactly what the military component wants to do. And actually within that, I see 2014 as a really important sort of stepping stone for NATO, that NATO is starting to orientate away from expeditionary operations and move back into the defence and deterrence space. But actually what 2014 and the operation in Crimea did was really push NATO along that route. And again, when I was in uniform, I was at NATO in 2014, and the response was, I would say, fairly slow, but I've actually been exceptionally impressed by the NATO response from early last year. And I think that is partly because what NATO has been able to do since 2014, really stepping up in all of the regards that we know. So the second point in terms of the UK perception of NATO within the Euro-Atlantic, whenever you read any UK defence documentation, we always talk about NATO primacy. The language may change to sort of the cornerstone of Euro-Atlantic security, and it's so automatic, it's actually almost meaningless. So when we start a new defence review and we've got a nice whiteboard and we get all the management consultants in and say, well, what should we write? Everyone goes, well, NATO primacy, that goes on the first sticky note. They put it up, and then we don't consider it anymore. And this is also a byproduct of Iraq and Afghanistan and other operations, that for the people who are in uniform, to promote to the senior levels, you needed the 1, 2, and 3-star commands that were available on operations, not necessarily in NATO headquarters or SHAPE. That started to change around 2012, 2013, 14, and we actually started sending some of our better officers to the really influential posts within NATO in terms of the policy and strategy, which we hadn't done previously because we were so invested in NATO operations, not necessarily the strategic part. And then also a structural change that happened that we're still talking about all the time, but obviously Brexit. Part of the reasons that Tony Blair in 1999 got together with Jacques Chirac and then created the ESDP, which is now CSDP, it was just partly that the UK wanted to manage Madeleine Albright's 3Ds, duplication, decoupling and discrimination. They wanted to manage that to make sure that EU structures did not encroach on NATO structures because of that primacy. But actually now what we're seeing is the space between NATO and the EU has started to widen. We had very good conversations here over the last couple of days that actually the comparative advantages of what NATO and the EU can provide to Euro-Atlantic security are starting to diverge. So for the UK, from that position, it's actually better because we don't have to spend all of that emotional effort and sort of diplomatic effort in balancing between these two multilateral organisations. It's much easier to cooperate with the EU, and that is going far better than it has been since post-Brexit due to bilaterally and also multilaterally. So, I'm pretty positive about that trajectory. And then also European security is not about those old cyclical arguments at the multilateral level of should it be just NATO or the EU. There's a lot of other formats. The Joint Expeditionary Force that the UK is heavily invested in, combined in Joint Expeditionary Force that we have for the French. Of course, we're also open to coalitions of the willing, which is in UK strategic culture, but within that NATO primacy. But I agree with Thierry, no unilateral operations anymore, which was the last time was in Sierra Leone in 2001. So my third point about the contribution that the UK makes to NATO within the Euro-Atlantic, and luckily we published our integrated review refresh a couple of weeks ago, which actually sort of tells you what it is and sort of how UK trajectory has changed. And I've read the documents, so you don't have to, but I would certainly say to skim it and actually look at some of the maps that we have put in to show the commitment to the UK and the sort of growing bilateral, trilateral, minilateral arrangements. But also there's a map that says the UK contribution to NATO, and we have 25 points on there which cover exercise, operations, standing commitments, and also the roles that we have. So it's pretty impressive. And what the UK wants to do ultimately is leverage our strengths and lead where we think we are best placed to do so. What we've actually seen is a shift over the last decade to Northern European security, particularly the Arctic and particularly the High North. So actually the only two geographic documents that the UK has put out on defence and security, both are on the Arctic and the High North. And the delineation that we kind of make is that the Arctic is very much for soft security, very much the preserve of the Foreign Office. But in terms of defence, it's very much focused on the High North, and examples of that is that we've just leased a 10-year lease with the Norwegian government to open Camp Viking, which is going to be where our Littoral Response Group North is based. And I see if you want to get a real sort of flavour of where the UK is thinking, get a map again, colour in the Joint Expeditionary Force members, then also colour in Poland and Ukraine for the new trilateral agreement that we signed last year, and then you get to see a really good representation of where UK geographic priorities are, and also in terms of that, carrier strike group to NATO response initiative. And then conceptually, again, really important, if you read the NATO strategic concept alongside the integrated review, you actually see that they are very, very similar documents in terms of the language used and positioning, and the UK has traditionally been very, very committed to NATO conceptual development and also ongoing NATO transformation. And finally, with the risk, the issue is that this is a lot to do, and we need to rely on allies and partners to do so, and that is what the documentation says. We have the Euro-Atlantic as the geographic priority, and then the second priority is the Indo-Pacific, and we've said that the security and prosperity in the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific are indivisible. So I read that as if you're prioritizing everything, you're prioritizing nothing, and almost your area of operational responsibility is the world without South America, large parts of Africa, and some parts of the Middle East. So it's very ambitious, and we are still in a position where we're moving from an expeditionary military very much back to one, focus more on territorial defence. So there's far more to do, but we will understand far more of that when the UK publishes its Defence Command Paper, which is the defence component of its foreign security and defence policy. And we'll hear that more on that in June. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ed. I think Finnish NATO membership will lead to deeper military cooperation between Finland and the UK, and I know that Ed and his colleagues are doing some thinking about this, and looking forward to reading your findings a bit later on. But Justyna, Poland is becoming a serious military powerhouse in Europe, so what's its approach to NATO?
Thank you. I will give you my view on where is Poland on NATO and on maintaining and contributing to cohesion in the alliance. But first, I want to thank you for the invitation to this panel and to today's seminar. I think that FIA does a great job deepening the knowledge, understanding, and exchange on NATO issues. And second, I do recommend the book. There is a solid source of information on national NATO policies, edited by Thierry. So from the Polish perspective, NATO is first and foremost a collective defense alliance, and has been such even in 1999, when Poland joined NATO, and when NATO actually started its paradigm shift from an alliance focused on deterrence and collective defense to an alliance focused on crisis management. The value of NATO as an alliance has been perceived since 1999 by all political parties in Poland, with solid public support, and NATO has been since our accession the main pillar of Polish security and defense policy. But at the same time as Norway, the Polish governments strive to complement NATO membership by developing strong ties with the United States, perceived not surprisingly as the main NATO ally. And second point, Poland, especially after 2008 and 2014, started to considerably enhance national defense capabilities, and this is even more visible after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. I wanted to give you a quick glimpse of how Poland found its place in NATO after its accession. I mentioned that 1999 was the time when the alliance turned from collective defense to crisis management, and the allies started to adjust their militaries and started to lower their defense spending. And Poland back then adapted actually to this changing paradigm. It started to take quite actively part in out-of-area operations in the Balkans and in Afghanistan, and also with the US and Iraq, perceiving it as a proof of allied solidarity and a contribution to cohesion, to collective security, if not collective defense. Even if NATO transformed then from a Cold War alliance to alliance focused on crisis management, the sheer membership in NATO was at that time deemed as enough of a guarantee to Polish security in a time of relatively low tensions with Russia. But this has started to change already in 2008. with the Russian-Georgian War. And this war has made Poland to loudly voice its concerns about Russia and loudly voice the need to come back to NATO's collective defense in terms of military planning, structures, capabilities, exercises, and also military presence on the eastern flank after 2008 in the alliance. And since 2008, Russian aggressive policies, perceived as increasingly threatening to Polish sovereignty and territorial integrity, have led Warsaw to refocus also on national defense from crisis management operations and to advocate for more attention to collective defense in NATO, as I said. And since 2014, this is annexation of Crimea, the neo-imperial policy of the Russian Federation, pursued also by means of military force, this is the citation from the 2020 Polish security strategy, has been perceived as the most serious threat. But coming here to cohesion, I think in the same document, as equally challenging from Polish perspective, the internal cohesion of the West and the survival of the transatlantic community in times of changing international environment was depicted. And that was the document was written before the war, 2020, in times of relative tensions in the alliance, which from Polish perspective might have conditioned the more of Russian aggressiveness towards NATO. And I think if you look why Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine in early 2022, it was also because he deemed that the Western community was in a relative disarray. So the cohesion of the alliance of the West contributes also to the security and to the deterrence within NATO. And since 2014, Polish defense priorities have found a better understanding within NATO and started to be shared, started to be responsed by NATO. And Poland played a key role and an active role, both in shaping NATO's deterrence and defense and in convincing allies to engage on the eastern flank and to put the military presence both in Poland and in the Baltic states, which has happened. And at the same time, Warsaw strived for a strong US component and strong US military presence developed outside of NATO as an additional reassurance. And this has resulted in enhanced forward presence in form of a NATO battle group in Poland, and it has also resulted in form of a US military presence, with Poland becoming a hub for US military activity on the eastern flank. Over the recent years, coming back to the issue of cohesion, while underlining NATO's need to come back to collective defense, Warsaw has also acknowledged NATO's 360-degree threat perspective and the need to maintain cohesion within the alliance between allies that were Russia-centric and the allies that perceived terrorism or crisis and conflicts in the southern neighborhood as a threat to their security. So Poland was aware of the challenges perceived by the allies in Southern Europe and was aware of the need to address these challenges if needed military, and also took part in operations, be it within NATO, be it within the EU or UN. And I wanted also to mention in this cohesion context, which might be interesting for Finland, Poland being an eastern flank country itself, has been since early 2017 sending troops to other Eastern Flank countries, maintaining a tank company in Latvia, regularly taking part in Baltic air policing in Lithuania and recently also in Estonia, and sending also a mechanized company to Romania. And as of 2022, with the new strategic concept being adopted by NATO, Poland has been quite pleased with how the threat perception and how the three NATO core tasks were redefined in this new strategic concept. With Russia being defined as the main threat alongside with terrorism, with the mention of China, and with how I think that Poland was also pleased how the three core tasks were redefined. First, with the focus on strengthened deterrence and defense, which is Poland's priority. Second, with crisis management, albeit with a lower ambition, shifted rather to crisis prevention and not active crisis management operations. And third, with redefined cooperative security, with going away from focus on maintaining or attempting to forge good relations with Russia, to focus on enlargement policy with Sweden and Finland joining NATO, with strengthening ties to partner countries in the Western Balkans, in the Black Sea, with Ukraine, and with enhancing ties to partners in Indo-Pacific region. And here I will stop, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Justyna, as NATO allies, Finland and Poland will belong to that Russia-centric group of allies, and I think there will be a significant overlap between Finnish and Polish interests in the alliance. But at this point, I'm looking at you, and I'll open the floor for questions. I think I'll first collect maybe three questions, and I think we have time for a second round, half an hour. So there's a good, nice space for discussion. But gentlemen there, is there a mic available for questions? Thank you. Yeah, it's streaming, so yeah.
Thank you. Anders Herdin, a retired diplomat and retired commission official. A question on the UK to Edward Arnold. The UK government has recently decided to raise from the 2% to the 2.5% level of GDP. But given that the British GDP has diminished, and given that the Royal Army is at its smallest size since many decades, what will actually be the real increase in capacity? How much does it only compensate for the negative development?
And then Ambassador Lassila here in the front.
Thank you very much for the valuable contributions. And I'd like to make three short points. One is about Finland becoming a member of the NATO, and our population is 1% of the NATO's population, and this 1% is now going to have the longest border with Russia. And that creates in the future interesting questions and problems. I hope that will be solvable. American hockey player Gretzky has said that a good player does not go there where the puck is. A good player goes there where the puck will be. And that is good advice for many political problems. But I go on. This border will be one of the most interesting border in the NATO history so far, I would say. And because it's so sensible, there are two sensible points from the Moscow, in the Moscow view, is Leningrad military region and of course the submarine bases near Murmansk. Russia will, with all it has, whatever Russia can do, is to defend those sensible points. And that they are not very far from our border. So where does it place Finland in your view? I have one more point. I have one question. Nobody has mentioned anything about Ukraine. And one of the questions is the NATO summit in Bucharest 208. It started something that ended in the crisis and war in Ukraine. Mentioning Ukraine, my last point will be, and there is a solution for Ukraine problem, one way or another. Anyway, it will be difficult, but one way or another, Ukraine must become a big Austria.
Thank you, Ambassador, for your observations and question. I appreciate as an avid hockey fan taking up Wayne Gretzky here in a FIA seminar. Looking for one more question for this round. Okay, we can start with these questions. So first about the UK, and then if we want to react, Ambassador Lasala's points or question on Ukraine and the Bucharest summit. So, Ed, do you want to start?
I'll field the UK question. So that's actually not what the Prime Minister said. He said that there is ambition to get to 2.5% by 2025, subject to new defence investment pledge. Now, there's a little bit of an issue that, since the war in Ukraine, the UK has had 3 prime ministers, which is very unusual. And they have at times had to speak to slightly different audiences domestically. So we had Prime Minister Boris Johnson say 2.5 by 2026, 3% by 2030. Prime Minister Truss said straight 3% by 2030, and then it's been sort of pared back now. The additional commitment that we have made is 5 billion, 2 billion of that on stockpiles because we don't have enough ammunition to fight as we would want, and also 3 billion to the nuclear subs program. This is in addition to 24 billion at the start of 2021, which generally will go to plugging an equipment black hole. So it's kind of, in terms of the risk that I talked about earlier, there is ambition in what we want to do in defence policy, but there is a gap in the capabilities that we have to do it. We are progressing, but it's still much slower than I think the UK would like to be moving at, and also certainly our allies.
It's on Ukraine. we can spend a full day talking about what's the reason why we are where we are. Some people argue that it's our fault, and I will certainly not agree with that. Of course, the West have done things that maybe not been the wisest over the years since the end of the Cold War, but maybe 2008 declaration is part of that. But I mean, you can add a lot of other things to what has happened since, with the deterioration of the Russian society. And I will put 90% of the explanation of what happens inside Russia, and not what we did. But anyway, that could be a seminar in itself. For solution, I mean, yes, I agree with you. We don't have peace in Europe until there's peace in Ukraine. We don't have stability in Europe until there's stability in Ukraine. And the solution right now is military. There's had to be a military solution somehow. What that means is up to Ukraine to define, in my view. If that means full liberation, or if they will stop somewhere, it's not up to us to tell them where to stop if they want to stop. But that's their decision. And after that, I mean, it needs security guarantees, because unless there's a regime change in Russia, they will come back. So Ukraine needs some kind of security guarantee. Of course, they want NATO membership. There are other ways of giving it as well, United States and others. But that's the requirement. You don't have peace and stability in Ukraine until that's in place. And following that, of course, reconstruction and EU membership and what have you down the line.
As a Pole in this panel, I think I will have a strong answer, and a very Polish one. I think, yes, it was our fault, what is happening today. Because of 2008, because we didn't give Ukraine membership action plan, and we didn't broaden the NATO guarantees to Ukraine, leaving Ukraine in a grey zone and allowing Russia to repeatedly, since 2014, invade Ukraine. And the result is the current war. How can we get out of the war, and how can we stop Russia's aggressive and neo-imperial policies? From our perspective, Eastern flank countries, Poland especially, by ending with buffer or grey zones in Europe, by enlarging Western Euro-Atlantic structures to Ukraine, both by giving Ukraine a credible EU membership perspective and EU membership, and a NATO membership perspective, and finally NATO security guarantees. That will be a long way, but I think this is necessary in order to stop Russia's dreams and ambitions to recreate spheres of influence, to recreate neo-imperial projects. And I wouldn't frame this as a Ukraine problem. I would frame it, first of all, as a Russia problem with which we need to deal quite wisely and strategically, and think about long-term solutions.
Thank you. I've identified 3 requests and all from my dear FIA colleagues. So first Sinikukka Saari, then Charlie Salonius-Pasternak, and then thirdly Tuomas Isomarkku.
Right. Thank you, dear panelists. My question goes to Carsten. You described really well how Norway has kind of found its identity within NATO. And I think Matti already indicated that, yes, indeed, in the Finnish debates, it is often mentioned as a kind of role model for Finland as well. But I only wonder, what does the Norway's model look in future? I think, is there a room for this type of arrangement, or do you see that it will evolve into something else? So does the Norway model apply to Norway in future? And yeah, and whether that can be then extended to other states as well, like Finland. Thank you.
Thank you. Charlie Salonis Pasternak. Headline is, paraphrasing it, One Alliance, Diverse Constellations. Jeff was mentioned already, but if we add Nordic cooperation, where there are clear operational benefits, what can we do to avoid the potential perceived risks to cohesion? So we don't get into a why are the Nordics only focusing on the Nordics type of discussions.
Yeah, two questions. One comment. I guess all of these go to Thierry. First of all, how durable, how permanent do you think this typology of that you presented us is? Do you see, for example, the war in Ukraine changing these categories in the medium or the longer term? Let's think about a country like Germany, which is geographically still rather close to Russia. Do you see them as moving towards that category of Russia-centric allies? And then also, how do you see changes in U.S. domestic politics and U.S. foreign policy as affecting this constellation? If we bear in mind the fact that the relationship between the individual allies and the US was considered as one key variable here. If there are major changes in US foreign policy posture, what does it mean for these different categories? The ones that are very dependent on the US and the ones that are perhaps slightly less so, or at least think they are less dependent on the US. And then finally, a comment. You mentioned the possibility that Finland's and Sweden's accession, or one issue where they could perhaps diverge from this NATO mainstream would be EU-NATO relations, or the view of how the EU should develop in the future. I don't really see that as a major factor. Actually, I think Finnish foreign and security policy documents have been rather clear for a number of years about the importance of NATO for European security, for security in the Baltic Sea region, and for Finnish security. So I don't really see that that's a very relevant point here.
Yes, I thank the fellow Fians for the questions and comments. Karsten, do you want to start?
Sure, thank you. Yes, I mean, first of all, our Norwegian policy has been changing all the time. The base policy and the non-nuclear weapon policy is there. But when it comes to the self-imposed restrictions, if you want to call it, that's something that we had decided ourselves. What does it mean? And it has changed over time, and it will change again. It will change because of three things at least. First is technology. The range of military weapons makes it kind of less point that you have kind of less military forces in Finnmark, because you can be in a B-52 out in the sea somewhere and reach deep into Russia anyway. So that idea about having a kind of a buffer zone for out of fear of Russian should be fear of we should attack them. It doesn't make sense anymore. The other one is it's political. I sense that change in Europe. You see it also in the EFP, that after Bucha and other things, you see how Russians conduct the warfare. We don't want that to happen to our cities. We don't accept this, that the Russians will get in a bit and then we strike back. We want to defend from the very start of the border. So to call, among, defense geeks about deterrence by denial, right? We don't want to let them in. And that is, that hasn't happened yet. It's not materialized in Norway, but I kind of sense this coming, that we don't want Kirkenes to be a Bucha in the future. So we need to rethink our post. That means we need to be more more military presence. And the third one is geography. You know, we have had these restrictions on our allies operating east of certain what's it called? I forgot the word in English. The geographic lines, yeah, whatever. I mean, if you look at the map, that goes through Finland, right? So I mean, and so if Finland gonna have any, I mean, presence in its own country, can't have the same, because that means you shouldn't have armed forces at all. So it obviously doesn't make sense. We also previously made exception for Finland and Sweden for this, but now when you join NATO, we cannot have that exception anymore. So we need to get rid of all that. And I think so. You know, so all those elements are making us need to rethink how we do our restrictions, self-imposed restrictions, if we still need them at all. Is there any point of kind of sending anything out, a reassuring signal to the regime in Moscow? Do they deserve that, so to speak? It's a moral question, but there is one argument in favor of still doing it so, and that's because of the special nature of the military installations in the high north, I mean the Kola Peninsula. It is a nuclear, extremely sensitive nuclear submarines there, and it is a cornerstone of Russian security and second strike capability. So if you rock that boat too much and challenge it too much, it will be destabilizing. And I don't think Russia is interested either in attracting too much Allied attention up north. We haven't seen anything since the war began, any increased or different military Russian behavior up north. I think they want low tension up north, and so we should, when we compose our force, the way we operate on the posture, we should have that in mind. There's a mutual interest still in not rocking that boat too much.
Just very quickly on Charlie's question, because I think it's quite easy to answer. Communication. We're all allies. We all have lots of formats to speak to each other, and I think that's really the only reason. And the example I think I gave to you over lunch was that, you know, Joint Expeditionary Force from a UK perspective, I think we're very good at communicating it to members, but not actually externally. So when I speak, for example, to Germans and mention Joint Expeditionary Force, they instinctively go, well, we don't like that. And then when you pick it apart, there's no reason that they don't like the JEF, they just don't understand what it is. So I think there's just more to say what the purpose of all of these formats are and where they can engage with non-members. I think that's just pretty easy, but we don't do it enough, and it's just communication.
I would just respond to one remark about the implication of possible changes to the US foreign security policy. With regard to Poland, a country that has strived for years to enhance ties to the US, the answer is to complement the strong military cooperation with the US by all possible ties, political, economic, industrial cooperation, and this has been happening over the past years and will be happening in the future. But the other response is to invest heavily in own military capabilities. And it's not only the reason the Russian invasion of Ukraine, but also the understanding that in the coming years the US footprint in Europe will still be there, but it might be smaller. And Poland and countries that depend very much on heavy US, or strong US presence, need simply to invest more in military capabilities, and this needs to be complemented by our main Western allies to equally invest more and to fill in some of the tasks that US right now is fulfilling. So therefore Poland will spend this year 3% of GDP for defense, and depending on political economic circumstances, we have parliamentary elections in autumn this year, we might head towards 4%. These are massive investments in security and defense, and we had huge military procurement programs started and being implemented last year and this year. And I think this is the answer to this question mark over the future US military engagement on the Eastern Flank and in Europe.
Yeah, on how sustainable the matrix is, I think it is to a large extent, but it was a bit impacted by 24th of February. So a couple of points here. One is that the main impact of 24th of February is an increased cohesion of the alliance and of all member states going like back to the center, if I go back to the issue of the distance. So if I look at it by the three categories, the categories of states that were Russia, and by the way, the book was written before 24th of February. But the category of states that are Russia-centric and US-dependent, they are simply vindicated in that posture, right? They are even more US-dependent, even more Russia-centric, if that is possible. So that category stays. And once again, I would put Sweden and Finland in that category when they join. If you take the category of the three countries that are like the least dependent and about which the distance is the longest, at least I see two of them that are come closer. The Biden administration, and in France, you also see that trend. But at the same time, to like comfort a bit the matrix that we have designed, one country, Turkey, is in a different category, right, in terms of the bilateral policy between Turkey and Russia and the ambivalence, if I can describe it that way. So you still have those elements of those countries that can play a role that has some distance with the core NATO interest, and part of the debate is what is going to happen in 2024 in the US that could also lead us to a situation where once again some ambivalent policy vis-à-vis NATO could appear. And then the third category, so the countries that are not Russia-centric but NATO-aligned, here maybe we've seen a few moves, but I wouldn't take Germany as the example, because if you look at some of the tensions between France, Germany on the one side and Poland or the Baltic states on the other hand, on Ukraine, I think those tensions validate the typology, because they are partly based on threat perceptions, strategic cultures, policy vis-à-vis the US to a degree. But in the UK, a clear ally of Ukraine because of a threat perception vis-à-vis Russia, does that mean that we should move the UK from the category of NATO-aligned but not Russia-centric to the category of NATO-aligned Russia-centric? I'm not sure. There are still specificities of the British policy, one of which being the broader security agenda than the UK still has, which does not characterize the countries that are in the other category. So I would say by and large, the three categories still apply to a large degree. And if you look, I haven't talked about Spain and Italy, but they are still in that category of states that look south, and they see the issue of solidarity with Poland, the Baltic state, and of course Ukraine, but they have another agenda. Which leads me to the question about how would a different US policy impact, because of course the countries that are highly dependent on the US are dependent on a US commitment to the alliance. So if that commitment is shaky or is evolving in a way that is not to their benefit, they would worry, and we have gone through that period under the Trump presidency. In terms of response, I see at least three. One is the national reflex, and we see part of the Polish policy in terms of increase of defense spending, and that you need to do something to hedge against a possible problem nationally. But that's probably not the main policy response. Another possible policy response that I think we've seen a few years ago, again with Poland, is the bilateral relationship. If NATO appears as not necessarily reliable, then maybe we need to explore possible deals bilaterally with the US, and this is, one attempt that was done by Poland and the US, and you had that debate also about conditional security guarantees based on who is spending the 2%, and based on that, security guarantees would apply by the US or not, which is, one way to look at it. But then the third way to look at it, which is not coming from this Russia-centric category, is the EU. Part of the debate about the necessity for the EU to equip itself with some defense capacity is precisely to hedge against a possible either US shaky, commitment, or the US pivot to the Indo-Pacific. So in those two situations, maybe NATO is not providing the security guarantee that it used to, or it's more, it's shaky, it's not reliable. Then we need to have another instrument, and that other instrument could be the European Union, and that's the debate about strategic autonomy or strategic sovereignty. So alternative, that leads us back to the issue of alternatives that European states, the ones that are EU members, need to come up with in case NATO does not deliver. That's a kind of scientific bias. It's when you design a research project, you want to have the best methodology and pick the best case studies, and but there are 30 countries in the alliance, and the question was, are we going to look at 30 countries? And for simply practical reasons, we thought that no. So then the question is, which are the countries that we are going to look at, which are the countries that we are not going to look at? And there were difficult choices. So Hungary is one, but I can think of a few others that I'm sure the second edition will add, in addition to adding Sweden and Finland.
Thank you. I know there are still some questions in the audience, but I'm afraid I have to close this extremely insightful session and discussion on NATO cohesion. Really grateful for our panelists for being available for this event, and thank you for sharing your expertise. I also want to thank the audience and your questions and comments. Needless to say, FIA is following closely all NATO membership related events. We expect positive news from Ankara any day, so we're living historic weeks and days. But thank you for coming. Have a good Wednesday, have a great evening, and see you again.